Well, good evening, everybody. How you guys doing? Well, good. Well, good. So, Cody, welcome home. Cody was born here, and in fact, his mom and dad are in the audience. Where are you guys?
There's a guy in the Bears hat.
Of course. They're here because they really want to go to the watch the football game afterwards, so they had to come here first. But no, seriously, Cody, welcome back home. Not only was he born here, he went to Northwestern. He teaches at Northwestern, but he did a few things in between, and that's what we're going to get to. So a speechwriter is really someone who tells a compelling story. But hey, guess what? It's not their story that you tell. And we're going to come back to that a little bit more later. But before we get into what exactly it is you do when you're a speechwriter for the President of the United States of America, first let's talk a little bit about you. And I think for the audience that doesn't know you, your words, your stories have touched hundreds of millions of people. But let's face it, you're not a household name. And so you should be a household name, in my opinion. But why don't you tell the folks a little bit about you and your roots and what it is about how your incredible parents raised you that in any way prepared you for that chapter of your life when you were in the White House.
Sure. Well, I was born and raised in the greatest city in the world, Wrigleyville, 533 West Roscoe, to my parents who are down here with my sister Carly. And I think probably what's most important is that they instilled in us from an early age a value of education. Both my parents have master's degrees. Both my mom's parents have master's degrees. My mom was a teacher. And gradually we moved north, as growing families do, as you age. We went to Evanston and then Wilmette, and I spent my formative years at Central Elementary and Wilmette Junior High. Then we moved out east for my dad's job, but I immediately came back here to go to Northwestern. And I started pre-med, actually, but chemistry weeded me out very quickly. And
me
so
too.
I shifted.
Organic or inorganic?
I didn't even get to organic. Just Chem 101 and I were not compatible. And so I switched to an easier science, political science.
Much easier science. All right, so let's fast forward. You apply for a job and are accepted on President Obama's 2007 campaign, summer internship. Describe a little bit of the path that you went from there to walking into the White House for the first time. And I think it's fair to say, I'm looking around, there are a fair number of our alumni, but there are probably some of you who've never been to the White House, let alone haven't worked there. So give us a little bit about what that arc was like from the campaign trail to walking into that White House the first day. I know I walked in the first time during transition with Mike Stropmanis, who's here, and we both burst into tears. Once we were relieved we got through security, because you start thinking about all those parking tickets maybe you didn't quite pay, and anything else that might come up. So once we got over that, we were just overcome with emotion. But describe what that was like to you, and did it ever get to a point during the 8 years that you were there where it felt like it was normal to work in the White House and that you really belonged there? Because you were pretty open in your book and vulnerable about your kind of own imposter syndrome, so that's a mouthful, but have at it.
Yeah, well, it's funny you mentioned that about the first day and the security gate. So my first day was the day after the inauguration, January 21st. And you're convinced that, because we don't have badges yet, when you hand your ID over, it's all been a prank,
yes.
Right? And they're like, you're not on the list, get out of here. But then the gate opens and they let you in. And you spend most of the first day in orientation, getting a laptop, signing an ethics pledge, getting your security clearance. And then I think it was January 22nd, that was the first time I ever met Barack Obama, and it was in the Oval Office, which is terrifying. I mean, I'd been on the campaign, and what a gift to get to work on that campaign in Chicago. It just grew by leaps and bounds like this crazy tech startup, and you make all your best friends there for life, just kind of working together all day long, and then going to the hula hands at the basement of the Illinois Center at night just to blow off a little steam before coming back 6 hours later. But I never met him on the campaign because he was always out campaigning. I think he was back in the offices like 3 times. But I was a junior speechwriter, so I'm not in the big meetings with you and Axe and Pluff and everybody. So the first time I met him was in the Oval Office, and he wanted to talk about a speech I'd written, drafted. So I'm sitting in my office in the executive office building, which is right across the driveway from the West Wing, and Katie Johnson, who was his assistant at the time, called me and said, the boss wants to see you. And I was like, you mean, like,
which boss?
The president? She goes, yeah, get over here. So I run across the driveway, but I had a green badge, and there are hierarchies of badges. And so I asked the Secret Service agent at the desk, how do you get to the Oval Office? And it's not their job to help you find the president. So he's like, you need
You
to.
can't find him, you're probably not supposed to be there.
Yeah, you need to call someone to come get you. So finally, Katie comes down. She's like, what are you doing? We've been waiting. I was like, Katie, I don't even know where the bathroom is, like, let alone anything else. And so you go in there, and I write about this in the book. It's the only room in the White House that looks the same as it does on television. And all the saliva leaves your mouth. You are just in full panic mode when you walk in there. And then there's the President of the United States sitting there, and you're just like, what? And so I vaguely remember we had a brief conversation where he said, I saw your name, and I just realized we've never met, and I just wanted to meet you. And he started asking me questions about Chicago, and he ribbed me about the Cubs for a little bit, and then I walked out, and John Favreau was standing out there. He's like, do you remember anything that just happened? I said, no. Nothing. But over those 8 years, my editor told me I was a little too frank at times in the book about it. But for me, the imposter syndrome never really went away because I was writing with him.
Yeah.
If it was anybody else, it wouldn't have been that profound. But always knowing that your boss is better at you than your job, and that he says it publicly all the time, and reminds you of it, is something that always you never really break free of it, even when you have moments where you think, I finally belong here, I've finally done a good job at this. But I actually think that's a good thing. I've thought about it over the years, and I think a lot of us had imposter syndrome in the sense that we didn't feel like we'd earned it. We didn't feel like we deserved to be there, and I think that pushed us to work really hard every day and prove it, to the benefit of the American people, I hope. I don't think the people who followed us into our jobs had that same sense of imposter syndrome. I think they felt like they were entitled to be there, to an adverse effect.
Yes, I would agree with that. All right, one more question before we get to Grace, which I do want to spend most of our time on. So the job of the speechwriter really varies depending upon for whom you're writing the speeches. But I think it's particularly challenging, at least in our White House, for you to write for the President of the United States, because you're not just sitting down with him and saying, what do you want to say? You're talking to the relevant policy councils. You're talking to the Office of Public Engagement. You're talking to a whole range of stakeholders. You got legislators who have opinions about what you should put in your speech. You have personalities. You got a lot of really smart people who think that they know what should go in your speech. And I suppose the one that's like the hardest is the State of the Union, but maybe walk the audience through like how you go about preparing for a speech when you are the speechwriter for the President of the United States. Lots of folks are in your kitchen, but ultimately you control the pen, although he does edit what you put in the pen, but describe the process a bit.
Yeah, until he delivers a speech, you're the most important person in the building as far as the speech is concerned, and everybody wants a piece of you. Everybody wants their thing in the speech. During the State of the Union address, it can get almost comical. I'm not going to name them, but there were staffers who would stake out the West Wing bathroom near my office.
Gene Sperling.
Gene was up there. And when I would come out to go to the bathroom, they would jump out of the seat and like push for something. I'm like, listen, there have been weeks of meetings about this. This is closed. The ones I did appreciate was every once in a while I'd come in the morning during the State of the Union process, and there'd be a bottle of bourbon on my desk with a card. And one year it said, "Don't forget the Department of Education." So they got like 6 paragraphs.
How come we didn't do that? We could have just bought you off.
Well, it's fascinating. I wrote about your office a lot in the book, as you know. And I was always fascinated by your job because you really had to wear 2 sometimes competing hats. You were his senior advisor, and so it was your job to protect his reputation, give him advice that was best for him, but you were also the liaison to basically every advocacy community in the world who often had competing interests with the presidents. I don't know how you balance that. It was challenging in speeches to have not just your office, but people in policy offices too, like, hey, we need to put this in there. We need to say this like this. We need to cater to this audience. And it could muddy the story. Maybe it's not what we want it to do. Maybe it's not the sharpest, smartest path forward. So there were a lot of battles around speeches, but I like to think we left them all on good terms.
Well, ultimately, you're telling a story, and if it's a, Christmas tree, as we used to call it, then it's not. You're getting in your own way of the story. But everybody wants their ornament on the tree, and your job in the nicest possible way is to manage that and get it done to his satisfaction. So ultimately, that's the reader that's most important. Well, let's talk about this. So here you are, at the time, not so much now, but at the time, a pretty young white guy. And you're writing speeches for the first black president.
Yeah.
How did that settle with you? And did it help that you started out working for Fabs, also a very young white guy, who mastered it? How did you deal with that?
I write about this a lot in the book too. Nothing ever made me feel whiter than writing for the first black president. And you can write for anybody. That's the purpose of being a speechwriter. You know, I've written speeches for Michelle Obama. I've written speeches for other women, and we had women on our team who wrote for the president. But it's different when he's the first black president. It's just he's the first one who is not white and has to speak to a country that has still not dealt with race appropriately. And there are all these different audiences looking to him to say what they'd been dying to hear from a president. And there were audiences looking to him who would immediately call him divisive for even saying something that was true. And it was always difficult to balance. The first time I really exhaled in 8 years was when Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's just this fabulous writer and thinker, wrote for 8 years, Barack Obama walked on ice and never fell. And that was like the first time I relaxed in 8 years. Because he did, but there were also, there were cautionary tales. The Skip Gates incident in 2009 or 10.
When he said that the police might have behaved stupidly when they arrested Skip Gates in his own home?
Yeah. And
you didn't write that, though.
No, that was ad-libbed. But you saw his support among white voters drop and never recover.
Never recovered.
That's it's a lesson. But some of his most profound things were ad-libbed on race. When he said, if I had a son, he'd look like Trayvon. That was him. That's not something that we could write for him. When he gave the race speech in 2008 and he said, I can no more disown my white grandmother, that is not a line that Jon Favreau was going to come up with for him. So the most important thing to realize is that Barack Obama was always our chief speechwriter. And he never went out and said anything he didn't want to say. There were times when we would have heated arguments in the White House about how much to constrain him. And I write about the moment after the Trayvon Martin verdict, which I think was a profound miscarriage of justice because there were no black people on the jury. And he was pretty angry. Yeah. And I was the only white person in the Oval Office, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. And he didn't really want to hear from me. But he was angry, but he also knew I can't just go out there and be angry.
An angry black man.
Yeah, it would be detrimental to everything we're trying to do. And it was Danielle Gray, to her great credit, who came up with My Brother's Keeper and ran upstairs and wrote down these great ideas that still exist and are still helping people now. So all of that's a long-winded way of saying it was difficult. And it was difficult because, even though he and I are from the same hometown, we're from worlds apart, right? We live on the red line, but it's worlds apart. And to be a speechwriter requires a sense of empathy, a profound sense of empathy that mostly comes from reading, but to be able to walk around in your audience's shoes, understand who they are. But there are limits to that empathy, right? I can imagine what it's like to be a black man in America, but no one's ever asked me for my ID or why are you here, or followed me at a department store, or taxis driving by. These are all things that have happened to him. I've never had to have the talk. I'll never have to have a talk with my child about what to do, if a police officer comes up to you. So there are limits to it, and you just do your best. But he was always there, and as our chief speechwriter, to be able to talk to him before every speech was the most important aspect of the job.
All right, let's turn to Grace. So read it. Buy it. Well, buy it, and then read it, and then buy it and give it to all of your friends. I think it's an extraordinary book. I enjoyed it thoroughly, and I lived these 10 days with you very intimately, as you describe in the book. But look, you started on the campaign trail, and you turned off the lights at the very end of the administration. There were, suffice to say, gazillions of moments that will stay with you forever. Tell the audience a bit about, Cody, why did you focus in on these particular 10 days of all of the different ways for your first book? Who knows what comes next, but why this in your first book?
Well, the sheer magnitude of the events that happened in just a 10-day span. I mean, I remember someone writing that it was too implausible for an entire season of The West Wing. And when I was writing this book, everybody I talked to remembered these events, but to a person, they said, I had no idea those all happened in the same week. And they begin with the white supremacist massacre in Charleston and the family's act of grace by forgiving the killer. And you then had Republican governors in the South start bringing down the Confederate flag over state houses. And meanwhile, we're all preparing like crazy for 2 impending Supreme Court rulings on marriage equality and Obamacare, like actually deciding whether or not millions of people are going to lose their health insurance, whether or not millions of Americans are going to be able to marry who they love or be deemed second-class citizens. And we don't know which way they're going to go. And we're preparing speeches for all of them. And in the background, President Obama is still, we had a pretty passionate debate as to whether or not he would give a eulogy at all.
Well, let's talk about that, because that's the only time I can think about, Cody, where you and I didn't disagree about the content of the speech, but whether or not there should even be a speech. So why don't you take the audience to when you started getting inklings that maybe there was a move afoot, and why was it you two and President Obama didn't want to give it as much as you didn't? Why not?
Yeah, we both sort of used each other as human shields that week. Neither of us wanted to do it because we had already written over a dozen eulogies together after mass shootings. And this goes back to Newtown in 2012 when 20 little kids were murdered in their classroom, along with 6 of the educators who died trying to protect them. After that, the president set aside his second-term agenda and decided to try to do something about guns, which we knew how long the odds were with the makeup of the Senate. But there was a glimmer of hope in that you had Pat Toomey, who's a conservative Republican from Pennsylvania with an A rating from the NRA, and Joe Manchin, who's a conservative Democrat from West Virginia with an A rating from the NRA. They actually teamed up and said, we'll write a background checks bill. And so that gave us hope to go for it. Ultimately, it failed after we spent months kind of barnstorming the country. And Republicans in the Senate blocked a vote on it with the parents of the Newtown victims looking on from the Senate gallery. And that's about as cynical as I've ever seen him. And it's one of the 3 times, I'm sure you've seen him angry more than 3 times. I've only seen him angry 3 times. And it's kind of terrifying. And as I write in the book, you know, his words could have cracked the planet in half. And he came back in from giving a passionate speech in the Rose Garden, and I was standing in the outer hall, and he said, the next time this happens, I don't want to speak. What am I going to do? I refuse to be part of this cycle where every time this happens, I go out and give a eulogy and give the country permission to move on. I don't want to move on. I don't want to do this anymore. And he had to do it 2 more times after that, after shootings on military bases, because he's the commander-in-chief and you just do. And Charleston was kind of the first major test of whether or not he wanted to do it or not. He didn't want to for the same reason. I didn't want to because it was hard and I was running out of words, but there was also the added component of race to it. And it just felt way too daunting. And, you know, as everybody just kind of went their separate ways for the weekend, the word I got was that he said no and didn't want to do it. So I kind of relaxed for 2 days. And then I came on Monday morning, and Valerie Jarrett's standing in the office and says, you know, I have a few ideas for the president's eulogy. And I said,
What eulogy? He's not giving a eulogy. I'm like, we'll see.
So I write in great detail in the book, we had a pretty heated debate in the Oval Office that day. You and me and President Obama and Josh Earnest and Jen Psaki about whether or not he should speak at all. And he did not want to, and I did not want to either.
What changed?
You were persistent. But actually what really changed was what those families down in Charleston did. If you don't recall, just 2 days after the slaughter, they'd captured the killer and he was in court for his arraignment on live television, and one by one, each of the family members went up to the microphone to get to say something to him. And they were crying, they were wailing. I mean, this person they were looking at had just stolen their parents and their kids, and in the worst way possible, and with vicious motives. He said he wanted to start a race war. You know, he spit epithets over their bodies. And one by one, they forgave him, even though they were crying, even though they were bawling. And, you know, I'd had some exposure to the AME Church through President Obama and through his pastor, Joshua Dubois, but it was totally alien to me to see this. It was not the type of thing that I could ever bring myself to do. And so Josh Earnest spoke up in the meeting and said, you know, if you do go speak, you could talk about that. You could talk about grace. And that was when I remember the president's shoulders relaxing a little bit. He came around the front of the desk and pontificated for a while, as he does. And by the end of that meeting, he said, listen, I want to go down there and hug those families. I'm not sure if I want to speak, but if I do, and that's when you know he's made up his mind.
If I do.
And the only guidance he gave me, he said, if I do, that's what I want to talk about. Talk about guns, talk about race, talk about the Confederate flag, but wrap it all up in grace. And so I go back to my desk going, like, I didn't have the slightest clue where to start. And he's talked about this in that podcast he did with Springsteen, so I'm not spilling any beans, but he admitted he didn't give me much to go on. But I also didn't give him a draft that met the moment in return.
It's a hard moment to meet. So how did it go from reluctance to crafting what I consider to be one of the best speeches he gave? And that's before he started singing. So how did you, tell us a little bit about the sausage, tell us what Miles Davis has to do with it. Give us a little bit of the flavor of how you got from a blank sheet of paper, which stayed blank for a while, to a really beautiful, beautiful eulogy.
It stayed blank for a long time. I ended up doing, one of my favorite methods of procrastination is to write a really long outline and find notes and just read widely and watch things. And so I had a 19-page outline for what needed to be like a 4-page speech tops. And there comes a point where you're just like, what are you doing? You have to stop this and start writing. And I would procrastinate by working on we had to do 4 separate Obamacare speeches and 4 separate marriage equality speeches for all the different outcomes. So I'd go work on those for a while. And then you just kind of run out of time, and it's like, I need to get him something. So I pulled an all-nighter on Wednesday night of that week, and then gave it to him on Thursday night, which is, it's the night before the eulogy. So this is day 9, is the first time he's seeing this speech, which is probably about 3 days late. And I knew it wasn't quite there, and I told him as much. And so he read it real quick and came and found me before I left for the day and said, you're right, the back half needs some work. But don't worry about it, go home, get some sleep. He kind of looked me up and down, and he was like, hey, go get some sleep. And I'll give it back to you in the morning. So I went home, and he called me at around 10 o'clock and said, can you come back? And it was 4 pages long. He had just drawn one line through pages 3 and 4, which he had never done before, ever. And I'd had 3 days, and in 3 hours, he rewrote the whole thing longhand. And I apologized to him, which I'd never done before, because I felt like I'd kind of profoundly let him down here. But this tells you why he's such a good boss. He could have yelled at me, he could have told me I sucked at my job, he could have, even worse than that, he could have given you the edits or Dennis the edits and just excised me from the equation completely. But he brought me in and spent a half hour walking me through them and taking care to point out that he basically tore up the speech right where I'd written Amazing Grace and then used the lyrics as a structure for the back half. And he said, look, we're collaborators. You gave me what I needed to work with here. You'll recognize some of your work in there. And when you've been thinking about these issues for 40 years, you'll know what you want to say too. And he just kind of beautifully took the lyrics to Amazing Grace and blew them out into this structure that was really simple. And I kicked myself for not thinking of it. But that's the type of thing he can do. And it still had never occurred to me. He actually wrote out the lyrics to the song. It still didn't occur to me that he might sing it until he told us the next day that he was thinking about it.
So let's talk about the next day. As I have said to you and many people, it was the most extraordinary day, I think, for me, that we had in 8 years. And it began with us, it began really the day before when the Supreme Court ruled on the Affordable Care Act for the second time. So we thought we'd kind of get a pass that Friday and that it would kick over into the next week before the Supreme Court ruled on marriage equality. So I remember being in Dennis's office and not really paying a lot of attention to the time, whereas we usually, the day the Supreme Court rules, we're on SCOTUS blog and like refresh. And we just lost track of time, and my assistant walked in with a note that said, marriage equality 5-4, and we won. And you had fortunately had versions for the speech, but we didn't think necessarily he was going to be giving it that day. So once you got word that marriage equality had come down, and he's still up working on the last draft of the speech for Reverend Pinckney, what was your morning like that day?
So I had lost track of time too. Usually at 10 o'clock, like you said, we're furiously refreshing SCOTUS blog, a website that was the fastest way to find out what was happening in the courtroom. We also had a lawyer in there, but it would just take more time for the lawyer to get outside and email us. I was still working his edits in while he was working on it upstairs, so I just forgot, and I found out because I heard cheers throughout the West Wing. I just heard people cheering, and then it was like, oh, shit, it turned on the TV. I needed it to be that day selfishly because I was on my last legs and could not have made it till Monday waiting for that ruling, but for the sake of the eulogy, I needed it to be that day, and I needed it to be a victory for all sorts of reasons, for the speech, of course, but also because I had been dreading, how are we going to look our colleagues in the eye? How are we going to look our gay colleagues in the eye if the Supreme Court tells them you don't ever get to get married to the person you love? I was just dreading that. And I had just gotten engaged, and it felt like if that happens, something about my own marriage will just feel less than whole or unfair. But I needed it for the speech, and I needed it for him too, to get his mind and heart in the right place, because he was the one. He even though there was a bunch of celebrating in the West Wing that morning, he was the one who stayed mindful that he's going to eulogize a black pastor who was murdered by a white supremacist. The day was just that big emotional spectrum, and a woman on my team, Sarah Perry, had drafted this beautiful speech for him, and I just added a little bit at the top about how this was the work of decades, you know, and only because of that work of decades and that slow, committed effort do you get days like this when justice comes like a thunderbolt. Because I wanted to remind people this is not something that he did. This is not something that, you know, activists do quickly. This is something that took 50 years more of committed effort. And he had a really beautiful ad lib at the end of the speech too, where he talked about how it was not just the result of a decision by the court, but also countless little acts of courage by people who came out and by parents and family members who accepted them until it was just overwhelming and there was no other option. And it was fascinating to watch because I had been prepared. You know, Marine One comes 5 minutes after he finishes speaking. So I knew when the speech was going to end. I was prepared to race back to my office, grab my backpack, be ready to go. He kept talking. And he ad-libs a lot in speeches, but it's usually somewhere in the middle, and he knows where his runway is to come back. When he starts that at the end of a speech, he's got to find a place to land the plane himself. And so I was just watching, like riveted to see what he'd do, and it was beautiful. And you know, he speaks slowly in general. He was speaking extra slowly. And I asked him afterwards, you know, what's the deal? Like, I thought he was genuinely moved by the fact that the country had come so far so fast, relatively speaking, on an issue of equal rights. And he said, no, man, I was just tired from working on your speech all night long. But I know that's not true. I know that's not true because he gave me back his edits at 11 o'clock, and he's usually up much later than that, so I still don't believe him.
Your line in that speech, and I would really recommend everyone go read that one as well, is beautiful, about the thunderbolt. I have used a lot lately because I think we all feel this sense of impatience for change and that it takes too long, and I think it is a privilege to be there for the thunderbolt. It's no guarantee, just because, in mixing my metaphors, you know, you can run that relay race and hand the baton off, and then the next person runs it, and then the next person, and then lucky you when they come to the end of the race and you're there to be at the finish line. And that's how I felt. I felt that what happened, the example of marriage equality and how it went state by state by state, it went from 2 states where it was the law of the land when he took office to 37 states in the District of Columbia by that day. In 2015, but that begs the fact that there were decades before that led to those first 2 states. And I thought you and he made that point really beautifully that day. I want to go back for a bit before I come forward to that night. So you also had a really strong hand in the speech you gave in Selma just 3 months earlier. And I remember seeing you in the crowd and the look on your face. You were hanging on every word like you hadn't heard the speech before, but obviously you wrote it. What was that like, and particularly did that speech in Selma help you with the speech that you did for Reverend Pinckney? Yeah,
the reason I was feeling that way that day is because that was the first time that he and I knew the night before a speech that it was a banger. Like, we knew, and I made it the prologue of the book for 2 reasons. One, so people could kind of see the process that we get to do when it's perfect, and it's never perfect. It was perfect with Selma because 2 days before the speech, we had a snow day in Washington. The federal government shut down because it snowed 4 or 5 inches, which meant—
You should mention, it shuts down when it doesn't snow at all.
Yeah.
I mean, those of you from Chicago, most ridiculous thing in the world. Like, right, our first year there, they called a snow day, and I remember when Sasha and Malia stayed home, and they came down to the Oval, and there was like no snow. And it was like, maybe it'll snow, and so they closed the schools.
Yeah.
We don't close the schools here.
Literally, the first page of the book is Barack Obama complaining that D.C. is closed for a snow day. But I took full advantage of it. Rather than just hang out on the couch, I went to work because I knew his meetings would be pulled down, and that meant I could get him all day long. And we passed 5 drafts back and forth, each one getting better than the last, and that just so rarely happens because there's always so much going on. That we just knew. I mean, by Friday night, then the speech was Saturday morning, we just knew this is a good speech. But he, like he always does, came up with the thesis for it, and just this beautiful— we actually covered it in my class today, and just this beautiful addition he just wrote, that Selma it was not a clash of armies, but a clash of wills, a contest to determine the true meaning of America. And what a great way to explain our politics, too, describe what our politics really is. So I stole it for the thesis of this book. I told him, but that's really, it helped me with the Charleston eulogy, but it really helped me with this book to think of it that way.
So one of the important thing that you touch on in the book, and you alluded to it a little bit earlier, but I think it's helpful. Look, it's a tough job. It's a pressure cooker. The deadlines don't move. If you got to do the State of the Union, they're not changing the date because Cody had a bad day or a mind block. You got to get it done. Describe a little bit, because I think it'd be interesting for the audience to have a sense of, like, who are your people? Obviously, you marry the most important person, but give us a sense of the people around you that were either part of your team or your colleagues. Where did you get the sustenance that you needed to stay for all 8 years in what is a really hard job? And when you first got the job, when Favreau left, like, who did you go to right away when you first found out? And did you apply for the job? Did you go in for a job interview? How did you get to be the head of speechwriting for the President of the United States of America?
The President and John decided that on their own without asking me.
No consultation.
No, zero. John actually came back from a trip with him and told me, which was exciting because that's why I was sticking around, but it was also horrifying because part of me was hoping it would never happen. Because I just knew it was a lifetime of stress. But it was, I called my parents all the time. And my mom was the first person I called after I found out I had to write the Tucson eulogy and then the Newtown eulogy. I had an amazing team at the White House that I leaned on heavily. They're all over this book. And of course my wife, who was at the time my fact checker.
Describe a little bit about what Kristen did and how that came into sometimes conflict with what you had to do.
Yeah, all the time conflict. She used the president's fireproofer. She made sure he didn't say anything he shouldn't at a venue he shouldn't be at with people he shouldn't be with. She was a pre-crisis consultant. She prevented crises. For multiverse fans, there are countless alternate timelines where Barack Obama screwed up, and my wife prevented them all. But that also meant that every single day she gave me a document of 20 things that I had written wrong that were all cited and sourced. God, it was brutal. But we still got married. And she does it for free now, just she doesn't actually make the document. Yeah.
All right, that's not good enough, though. Where did you meet? How did you fall in love? How did you propose? Because you're busy, and you made time for all that. So give us the arc of your relationship. Knowing your parents are here, so,
Well, actually, just like my parents, we met on our first day of work. They also met on my mom's first day of work. Kristen was just introducing herself to staff, and I was toast. But I played a long game because I didn't want to lose my job. So, it took. I think we didn't go on our first date for about 6 months. And I still played a long game after that. But another thing about the White House is we all leaned on each other. Nobody ever really believes this, even though it's true. We were a family in that place, and mostly because we had just been forged into one during the longest primary campaign in American history. But when people's parents died, we went to the funerals. A bunch of us lived together. I lived with Michael O'Neill and Tommy Vitor, and then Kristen moved in with us even before we were married. I mean, we were a family. And, even when Kristen and I would fight like cats and dogs over facts, because my wheelhouse was mostly true, for the sake of the story, we still went home together every night, And I proposed on the top of Rockefeller Center so that she could see her native Staten Island in the distance. And Obama, infuriatingly, I told him about this maybe a week or two before, and he said, just make sure you take an umbrella. And I was like, that's a weird thing to say. And he was right, it rained. And of course, I went back and told him, and he was like, told you.
He looked at the weather forecast.
I run the National Weather Service.
Of course I know when it's going to rain. That's what I do. Best speech?
Oh, easy. When the Cubs came to the White House after winning the World Series. No, his best speech is Selma, because it's the purest distillation of his vision of patriotism, what it means to be an American, what American exceptionalism means. That's like, if I could assign that speech, that's the one speech that people should read, and it'll make you feel really good about this country. I'm only half kidding about the Cubs one. I'd always joked to people when they'd say, "Why haven't you left yet?" I'd always joke, "I'll leave when the Cubs win the World Series," and then they did. And it was a real fight to get them to come before the end of the administration, because they usually come to the White House the next summer when they play the Nats. And this was even before the election. Anita Decker and I were like, all right, well, whoever wins the election, whether it's Hillary or Trump, we are not letting them get the Cubs. So this was like an all hands on deck effort. We finally got them 4 days before leaving the White House. And typically when a championship sports team comes to the White House, the president's busy, so you write 5 minutes of remarks tops. I handed him a 25-page speech. And he looks at it, he's like, "What is this?" I was like, "Just read it. It's the last week, like, just read it." And it was our lives. It was, stories of people who took the radio to their parents' grave sites to listen to the World Series, and people who'd grown up on the Cubs. And you knew it was special because it was the only time the First Lady ever came to a sports team event. And she talked with the whole team and took pictures. And she was talking about sitting on her dad's lap watching Cubs games on WGN. And you see like Javi Baez crying in the corner. It was beautiful.
One speech you wish you could write again, a do-over?
Oh, all of them. I'd keep editing forever. I really would. I'd still be editing this book if I didn't have like a litigious deadline. That's a great question. No one's asked me that. Like, if I could get a full do-over, I don't know, because it's often the mistakes that make the next speech better. That's my diplomatic answer.
That's a good one. So what did you learn, or what have you learned, not just in those 8 years, but over the course of your life? Because now you're teaching, and I'm sure there are those in this audience who would benefit as well. What advice would you have for them? What are the best tools that you think you have refined? One of them is rewriting. I had a law professor who said there's no such thing as good writing, just good rewriting. But what are the kinds of pieces of advice that you give your students and that you might offer this room?
People tend to overcomplicate speech writing, myself included, but the first question Obama and I ever asked ourselves in each meeting was, what's the story we're trying to tell? If your speech isn't telling a story, you need to go back and start again. And it should be a story that only you should tell. And you also want to place it in the broader arc of the presidency. Like, his presidency told this story. You can go all the way back to his 2004 speech. A lot of what we had in the farewell address, it's different times, it's 12 years later, it's adapted, but it's still the same theme. My students' assignment this week is actually storytelling, and I want them to focus on what their story is. And I pretend that they're running for president, they're doing their announcement, and they're, like he did in 2004, they are linking their story to the story of America. And I had a couple students after class who came up and said, "This would never work. I don't belong in my hometown. I don't like my hometown. We don't have the same politics." And I said, that actually makes it better. And then you see this kind of light go on. And I'm not going to get too personal about the students, but I said, think back to Obama's speech in 2004. This is 3 years after 9/11 in the United States of America. And you've got a black man named Barack Hussein Obama standing up on stage that almost no one had heard of outside of Chicago. And he tells a story about his life, which is very different from the normal political life. He's got a father he's met once, black father from Kenya, white mom from Kansas, grew up all over the world. And he links his story to the American story by saying, in no other country on earth could my story even be possible. And that completely changes the way people start to see themselves, as did the presidency. And it's not just that for 8 years, kids, my students now, they're 21, They were, like 8 when he took office? He's the person that they know in the White House. So it's not just that a generation grew up seeing a black first family and a black first family that conducted itself above reproach. I think his legacy is going to be what those young people end up doing with their lives. And I think a lot about something that the First Lady said at the portrait unveiling a month or two ago. She said, someone like me wasn't supposed to be here. And then I started thinking, these are still her words, and then I started thinking, well, who gets to decide what supposed to means? And I think the Obamas changed that definition just by virtue of who they were and what they were doing, that I think their greatest legacy will be more young people running for office who aren't supposed to be running for office. People who actually look like the country. And at this point, I've gotten so far away from your question, but I'm
That's okay.
really proud
That's
of my
all
answer.
right. I liked your answer. It was a good answer. In about 2 seconds, I'm going to open it up for questions from the audience. If you have a question, make your way down. We have a speaker for you. Don't be shy. It's a nice, cozy group, so I'm hoping that there will be some questions. But one last question I have, and I may think of some more, but when you think about the Barack Obama that enticed you to apply for an internship, what was it that you saw in him all those many years ago, and back in 2007? And when you think of him today, what has changed in terms of your impressions of him?
Well, what first grabbed me actually is I was on the floor in Boston when he gave that speech in 2004. I was working for Ted Kennedy at the time, and as a reward for volunteering on the convention, we got to go one night, and I just happened to be there the night he gave that speech. And he talked about politics the way I wanted it to be. And it's still never quite been that way, you know? And some days it feels worse than ever, but we tried really, really hard. And lots of people did, and lots of people still do, you know, every single day. That in him hasn't changed. I think a lot of people are going to have fun seeing him hit the campaign trail over the next couple of weeks. But I think he still has that faith. You know, the farewell address was a fun one to work on with him because it just showed how little he'd changed. Did I enjoy, he asked me to stick around, and I mean, this is public knowledge, and assist him on his memoirs. Did I enjoy that? Not really. Being with him when he's got writer's block on a 758-page book is no...
It's no picnic,
no,
believe me.
I was just going to say no picnic. But you know, I actually just got to see him at a wedding a few weeks ago of two of our staffers, right? He's still the same boss. He's still the same boss.
Yes, he's a constant. In fact, his wife said it best, I think, Cody, when she spoke at the 2012 convention, and she said people often say to her, what's changed about her husband since he's been president? And she said, nothing. It's just revealed who he is. It's a test.
Yeah.
And so, you know, you get to kick the tires a little bit and see if your initial feelings were right, but he is pretty much a constant.
Yeah, the only difference, he curses a lot more when the cameras are off and he's behind closed doors.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that is true.
But even at this wedding, because he came, they confiscated all of our phones at the door, except for his. And he was the only person who was recording their entire first dance like a proud dad.
Of course.
Like a proud dad.
I don't think there was a camera on the phone that he had in the White House. If not, he never used it. But since he's had a phone with a camera in it, he's now become a photographer. And I don't know what he does with those photos, but he does take a lot of them. All right, who's coming down and asking questions?
Who are making their way down. So come line up here, but I'll start us off with a question from the virtual viewers, which is, you both seem to be people who have had what many of us consider to be dream jobs. What advice would you have for people who are looking to go into politics or someday work in the White House?
Do it. Do it. I mean, we did have dream jobs because there was just an extraordinary amount of luck involved and being at the right place at the right time, but also, you know, years and years of hard work and surrounding yourself with the right people. It's not easy and it doesn't work out for everybody, so it's easy for us to say, but do it. I tell my students that this is something worthy. It's a worthy vessel into which they should pour their efforts because you can actually change a lot. You know, and in Washington, politics and press cover it as a game a lot of the time, who's up, who's down, but what you do on a daily basis, even if you're not in the White House, can change countless lives, and it's just absolutely worth your time.
I'll have a caveat to Cody's answer. I think it kind of depends on who the president is. And I think when you're young, particularly, just getting an experience. I loved your immediate reaction, which is like my grandmother used to say, put yourself on the path of lightning. Get in there and get a good experience. But I do think, in a sense, we were spoiled because we worked for somebody who we respected and admired and loved, and we knew that he would always have our back. I can't think of a single time, we've seen him angry. I honestly can't think of a single time he raised his voice. But more importantly than that, I can't think of a single time where he didn't do what he thought was right for you. And that is such an extraordinary experience, to work for an elected official whose true north just doesn't waver. We never had to wonder, like, was he going to come to work and suddenly decide he only wanted to talk to the people who voted for him? I'm not going to get any further along the lines than that, but I just think it does matter who you work for. But if you can get in the arena, you learn a lot, and you see what it's like to be in there, and you see that you can, make hard decisions and make mistakes and bounce back and live to tell about it, and it will enrich your life, and it'll give you things to tell your grandchildren. Hello.
So I work in marketing. I'm a writer, and in marketing writing, I try to persuade or change minds sometimes. And sometimes I have to write speeches for people, but I never like what the speeches sound like because speech writing is different, I think. And so I'm wondering like how you get an authentic kind of feeling to like your goals as a speechwriter in terms of getting that authentic voice. How does that happen?
Yeah, this is another answer where we were spoiled by virtue of who we worked for, because you have to spend a lot of time with that person. And that can be really difficult. I've had clients since where they just don't make time or have time. But I tell them, Barack Obama was the most powerful man in the world, and he made time for his speechwriters. And it wasn't for our benefit, it was for his, because he knew that we were listening to him, that it wasn't filtered through somebody else, like a communications team or wherever. Then we would travel with him, we would talk with him, we would get his unfiltered download, and that's really the only way you make that connection that is vital to speechwriting. I mean, he really viewed speechwriting as a collaboration. And the only way we got to know not just what he wanted to say, but why he wanted to say it, was spending time with him. So that's a long-winded way of saying it's really unfair if you don't get to do that as a speechwriter. And every time I've ever talked to anybody who's looking for a speechwriter, I say, you have to spend time with your writer. You just have to. And trust me, it'll be better for you. If you can't do that, then you just kind of consume everything they've said to just kind of figure it out. But even then, it can feel a little bit like mimicry until you really got to get in that person's head and just push to just give me 15 minutes, right, twice, and work with this, play with the edits. Like, I'm sure everybody's seen at this point how Pete Souza's photos of how Obama would just tear a speech apart. That made us better. Once you realize that you're not getting an F from a teacher, you're actually getting, good marks because you gave him something he could work with. That's a really good feeling, and it just goes a long way if it's a collaborative relationship.
It's not going to be a gotcha question, I promise. I had always heard writers, screenwriters, television writers say that comedy is harder than drama. And, I'm thinking about the correspondence dinners in particular, which to the audience seemed like so much fun. Was writing for that more difficult than the other speeches, or did you seem to enjoy it as much as it looked like you enjoyed it?
It was more difficult for me. I find writing jokes very difficult. Drama's easy, emotion's easy. But those were our most collaborative speeches. We would cast a wide net to professional comedy writers on, I'm not going to dime out the shows, but late night shows that you all know. We'd probably have 12 to 20 cooks in the kitchen, but everybody just submitting jokes. We'd say, here are the topics, give us your best jokes. And then we would choose kind of the best from each person and weave them together, but that was never my forte. I think I maybe got one in each dinner, tops.
You played a good pirate, though.
Thanks, man.
I'm curious about the choice to, instead of write a memoir of a whole experience, to really focus in on 2 days they talk about in screenwriting. To get dramatics, you need a tighter timeline and a narrative, and I thought it was a really exciting choice. I'm excited to read the book and how you did it. I know there was a book about 2 days in the Kennedy presidency, 2 days in June, I think it's called. I was wondering if you'd read that, but as someone, I've written a few historical books, and the most recent was about 9 days on the Kennedy campaign when Martin Luther King was in prison. And it was a tremendous challenge because it was all this context I needed the reader to know, so I'm trying to draw things in, but it was ultimately very gratifying because I felt like we have narrative momentum here. So I'm curious about your choice because I think it's a really exciting one to decide. Instead of telling the whole 8 years, I'm going to tell 2 days, but you'll learn about the 8 years along the way, but how hard of an editing process that was to really pull that off.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that because I originally wanted to name the book 10 Days in June, but 2 days in June is already taken, and 9 days is taken, and it just felt like maybe a little confusing. What I didn't get to in my answer before with Valerie is that all of these events in these 10 days spoke to something bigger they all spoke to who we are as Americans and whether or not we actually believe that all of us are created equal, whether or not we're going to stand up to white supremacy, whether or not people who are working 2 jobs have a right to health care, whether or not people who, love someone of the same gender get to get married. These are all like vital questions about who we are and what we believe in, that we are living out every single day right now in real time in our politics. That's why the subtitle is 10 Days in the Battle for America, because we're still in this clash of wills, as Obama called it. We always are. The American story is, it is bursts of progress followed by backlash over and over and over again, and it's the people that stick with it that ultimately win out. It was difficult. I'll be frank, it was a little difficult to do drama over the 10 days because there was a weekend in the middle where not much happened, So I wasn't just going to skip from day 3 to day 6. So there's a little creative narration in there in the middle. But like Sunday was Father's Day and Obama was golfing in California, and I was at a wedding, and I'm not going to like recount all that in the book. So I actually used that to kind of write about race a little bit and expand on these topics a bit, but then the drama comes back in full swing on Monday morning.
Okay, it looks like we don't have any more in-person questions, so I'll ask one more from the virtual viewers, which is kind of a fun one, which is, were there any Chicagoisms in the White House? Like, did you have Portillo's flown in or eat Garrett's popcorn?
Garrett's was somehow around all the time. We had like the entire Portillo's like beef extravaganza flown in a couple times. Like you get the styrofoam coolers and the buckets of gravy. My office, which we called the Speech Cave, had no windows. It was under the Oval Office, so it was just like the same color yellow 24/7. But my office was entirely decked out in Chicago sports memorabilia, like cornhole boards, like the Bears posters. I had the infamous photo of Ditka flipping the finger like right over my computer. It was like Chicago Sports Central in there. But what other food did we have? We had Chicago dogs at the mess every once in a while.
I was going to say, we had visitor chefs that came in from Chicago from time to time. Yeah. But there were a lot of us there, so our presence was felt. I have one last question, then we're going to call it a wrap. But I know Cody's going to sign books in the back for those of you who I know are going to buy them. But which came first, Grace, the title, or Gracie, the daughter? And give us your thoughts on the choice of the name for your daughter.
They were born at the same time. And this way I don't forget either of their names. They were both born in the fall of 2020. That's when somebody finally bought the idea for the book so I could start writing. And Gracie was born 2 weeks after. And they're both named after the general concept, obviously. For Gracie, our daughter, we had just moved to New York City 2 months before the pandemic hit. And we found out we were pregnant 2 weeks before New York shut down. And it was a scary time. I mean, you had 30-something thousand people dying pretty quickly. There was a morgue truck across the street from our apartment. It's like, what are we doing? And then you had a whole month of protests after George Floyd, which were I think net a good thing. But you still had like a helicopter overhead all night long, and it was just making it impossible to sleep. And then you had the election that was contested for a little bit too long. Gracie hung on 4 days. She was due the day that Joe Biden finally won, but she hung on an extra 4 days just to make sure. But through all that, through a very tumultuous year, she was complication. It was a complication-free pregnancy. There's no such thing as a relatively easy pregnancy, but she was complication-free, and every night at 11:30, she kicked like clockwork, and she was just this like reassuring constant that we didn't deserve. And we sat on it for a day. She didn't have a name for a day, but it was just a no-brainer. So we call her Gracie. It's
a beautiful name. Well, I want to say to your parents and sister, thank you for raising such an extraordinary, not so young man anymore. It was an honor to work with you for all 8 years. I consider you a friend. I was delighted to be here tonight. I hope all those who are tuning in will enjoy. And those of you who are in the audience, please join me in thanking Cody Keenan.
Thank you, Valerie.
Thank you so much for coming, and thanks again to Valerie and to Cody. A reminder that